everyone. Thank you, Richard Moss, MD, surgeon, private practice here in Jasper, Indiana. Welcome again. I wanted to talk about slavery. It's become the issue in this country. We ended it 150 years ago, but the left wants to continue to bring it up because they think they're onto something. This is the way they're going to discredit and delegitimize the country. And I think it's important to go through this. And I listened to a podcast by Peter Schiff. He's a well-known libertarian, economist. He's on a lot of the money programs and very smart guy. And so a lot of this is from a podcast I heard from him and then other information that I researched myself. But I think it's time to drive a stake through the heart of this vampire, because there's only so much that we can take. This endless harping on slavery serves one purpose, and that's to separate, to divide the country, to engage in more racial politics, and really its main purpose is to delegitimize this country, to delegitimize the founding and the founders, okay, and to utterly discredit the country for their own nefarious purposes, which is basically, as we know, to bring down the country. All right, and in the rubble and the ruin of this great nation, to recreate their little Marxist utopia, which, as we all know, as we see today on our TV screens in Cuba and throughout history, is a nightmare. And that's it. That's what they want to bring upon us. And they figure they got a way here to break the back, to break the spine of this country. And that's on this issue of slavery. Because everyone knows slavery never existed anywhere else. Slavery was invented in America. We all know that, right? Never heard of slavery before. I mean, I think I remember reading in the Bible about the Jews being enslaved. We have our Passover Seder. This is 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And I guess they had slavery then. They had slavery in ancient Egypt, the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, all of history. Even our nice little Indians, here, there, in North America, in Central America, in South America. Yes, even those, nice, wonderful Indians, the indigenous people, as they refer to them, they had slaves too, yes. Slavery was universal. Slavery existed everywhere. But let's go through the record of slavery, and in particular of this country and its role in slavery, and particularly its role in ending slavery that spearheaded the effort to end slavery. We're going to go through it a little bit. So we understand that slavery was a universal. Slavery existed everywhere. Slavery has been around since the dawn of time. All right, people enslaved others. They would fight battles, skirmishes, wars. They would capture their enemies and they would enslave them. Okay, so that's where slavery begins, and that's where we've always had slavery. That was part of the booty of going to war, of engaging in conflict, whether it's on a small tribal level or if it was on a national or a level of an empire, a transnational empire. Slavery was always in the mix. That was part of the booty of going to war. So yes, slavery has always existed. It was not invented in the United States. No matter what the left, no matter what the Democrat Party, no matter what the Marxist, communist, left/Democrat Party, no matter what the media says, it was not invented in the United States. I'm just letting you know that, in case you didn't know. So slavery is universal, but let's talk about slavery here in the Americas and in Europe. And we know that in terms of the Atlantic slave trade, where slaves were taken from Africa and European powers then brought them to Europe as well as to the New World, and basically to the colonies that some of the European powers had. But that slave story began around in the 1450s with Portugal. And it's important to understand that the Portuguese, and they had their colonies, and they brought the slaves from Africa to their colonies starting in the 1450s, all right? But it's important to know that they didn't just go and capture free Africans. It didn't work that way at all. They basically, African tribes traded their slaves that again they won when they went to war, and they would capture their enemies and they would enslave them. So these were African slaves that were traded by Africans because they wanted to trade with the European nations, first Portugal and then Spain. And so these were African slaves captured by African tribes. So it wasn't some wonderful little paradise in Africa. They were going to war, enslaving their enemies, and then they would sell their slaves to get whatever goods they wanted from, in this case, Portugal. What did Africa have to trade? Well, basically slaves. I mean, what did they make? Not much. Their chief export was slaves. Okay, that was the main dominant export of Africa. It was slaves. All right, and so they would trade with Portugal, and Portugal would then bring them to their various colonies, including Brazil, where there's actually a lot of slaves. And then later on, let's say the early 1600s, Spain got in the act, and it also traded with African tribes, and they would trade with them and bring slaves to their colonies in the New World. So this is where we're starting to see the Atlantic trade, slave trade that was bringing slaves to the New World in terms of the Americas, well, not so much North America yet, but Central America and then South America. Then you started to see in the 1700s. So again, remember, this is getting up to 300 years after this Atlantic slave trade started with Portugal in the 15th century, before you started to see African slaves brought to the Americas and brought to America, North America, and that would have been in 1619 in Jamestown, all right, the famous 1619 project, that we all know Nicole Hannah Jones, just a real fraud in her efforts to try to, again, delegitimize this country, that she states that America was founded on slavery, which is absurd. By the way, America was a British colony in 1619. That was Jamestown. That was a British colony, so it was not America at that time. But that for another day. So we started to see slaves coming into America, brought in by England, and but not in great numbers until mainly from 1740 to 1780 is where you're having a fair amount of slaves coming in. And so yes, we did have slavery in the Americas brought in by the British, and so again, this was about 300 years after the slaves were being traded from Africa by Portugal and then by Spain. So slavery had been going on, and it was not in America for 300 years. And then it started to pick up. And in total, there were about 12 million slaves that came out of Africa, what they call the Atlantic slave trade. Out of that 12 million, 4 to 5 million were brought to, let me take that back, not that many, 400,000 to 500,000 were brought to America. So that number then is about 5%. So it's important to remember, most of the slaves that came to the Americas through the Atlantic slave trade by the European colonial powers, 95% of them went to Central America, South America, and to the Caribbean islands. You would never know that, the way they talk. It was like, only America. But that's a lie. That's called fraud. That's utter deception. It's a fabrication. 5% of the total number of slaves came to America. The overwhelming majority went to the other countries, what we refer to as, yes, Latin America. All right? Central, South America, and then the Caribbean islands. Not to the British colonies. Very, very small numbers there. All right? So we got that. It's important to understand that. Brazil, for example, had about 4 or 5 million. Basically 10 times the number. They got 40%, but you never hear about that. It's one thing. The Marxist left, the Marxist Democrat Party left, has been using this slavery issue, that part of our history that we all acknowledge, as a way to break the back of this country, as if it was an invention of America. But that's a just so it's understood. All right, then we'll hear often about how other countries freed the slaves. And, the first nation to free the slaves was Haiti, and that was in 1804. We all know Haiti is a real paradise, right? I mean, look at all the great things that have come out of Haiti. But all right, let's give them credit. They ended slavery in 1804. All right, and then the next country was Mexico. That was in 1829. All right. Then you had Britain, which was 1833, France and Denmark, 1848, and then America, 1865. So, we're criticized because, look, we were last. We were last on the list. What about all these other countries? They freed the slaves. What I want to make clear is that we were not last. And by the way, there's a lot of countries that came after us that freed the slaves, their slaves later, like Brazil, 1888, Saudi Arabia, 1931, Mauritania, which is a country in Africa. When did they free their slaves? This is Africa. I mean, Africa, that's the gold standard, Africa, right? Everything's good in Africa, right? That's the narrative. Well, when did Mauritania, an African nation, predominantly black, when did they free their slaves? Well, that was in 2007, my friends. 2007. All right. But what I want to tell you is that actually, America was not last to free the slaves. America was first. And I want to, really focus in on this because to understand this, it's important to know that in early America were colonies. They were the British colonies. There were 13 of them. These colonies became states. And Americans then felt themselves more to be citizens of their states. First, their colonies, but then they were British citizens or subjects. But then when they formed states, they had a greater allegiance to their state. So a Virginian, someone from Virginia was a Virginian first and an American second. Okay, if you were from New York, you were a New Yorker first and an American second, and on down the line. They identified themselves primarily through their states, and it's important to understand that. They were a confederation of states. They had not even formed a union, but even after the Constitution was ratified, most people, and mainly we're talking now before the Civil War, after the Civil War, that allegiance, I think we could say, perhaps shifted more to the nation state. But certainly before that, the primary allegiance was to their states. And so I what happened in the states? Well, the first state, and at that time, yeah, I guess it would be a state. It was actually not a state. It was Vermont. They uh, they abolished slavery. They made it illegal in Vermont. And that was in 1777. And they actually were not part of the original 13 states. They were the first state to join. They were the 14th state. But they ended slavery in Vermont. That's 1777. That's well before Haiti. Haiti waited until 1804. And so, they're almost 30 years ahead of them. All right. And then you had other states that ended slavery, made slavery illegal. And, the next one was Pennsylvania, and they were in 1780. And then you had the Articles of Confederation, which were in 1781. And this was before even they had signed the Articles of Confederation. Then you had Massachusetts in 1783, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island came on again in the next several years before the Constitution was ratified. So at that time, you had 5 out of 13 states that had outlawed slavery. So they were the first. America was the first. And then Vermont was the 6th state. So you could say 6 out of the 14 states had ended slavery. Then you had New York joined in 1799, and Ohio in 1802. They became a state in 1803. And so you've had 8 states out of 17 that abolished slavery. And again, reminding you that the primary allegiance of those early Americans was to their state. That was a confederation and a union of states, but they identified with their states. So we were way ahead of the rest of the world. But it's more than that, my friends. It's important to remember that in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, who we always hear, in the efforts by the left to discredit the founding fathers, he put language in to the Declaration of Independence to end slavery, to call for the abolition of slavery. But that had to be taken out because of the southern states like Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina that would not have joined, would not have signed on the Declaration. They would not, unless they got rid of that part that Jefferson wanted to include. And so in the effort to create a union of the 13 colonies that would agree to sign on the Declaration, he had to get rid of that language. But even apart from that, the language in our great preamble to the Declaration of Independence, in which we talk about that all of us are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. This introduced this world historic concept of equality before God, of God-given inalienable rights. We acknowledge that it would take another 70 years for us to finally fulfill the dream of that wonderful statement, that wonderful preamble in the Declaration about that we are all created equally and again endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the message, the vision of that equality was placed right there in our founding documents. And eventually we would fulfill that dream and that vision of equality and of ending slavery. And as I said, we had all of these states well before Haiti in 1804, well before the rest of the world that came after Haiti. We were first to free our slaves in this country. All right, so let's just set the record straight on this, my friends. So there's no question. We led the way to ending slavery. We were not last. We were first. Okay, commies, okay, little Marxists, lefties, Democrats, always trying to discredit this country. All right, the record is clear. We led the way to end slavery. We were trailblazers in ending slavery. All right, my friends. What about the founding fathers? We always hear, of course, about the founding fathers. You know, they were slaveholders, right? Every one of them. Well, not so at all. We had many founding fathers that were abolitionists that really despised this hated institution of slavery. And who were they? Well, John Adams, our second president, and Sam Adams, Roger Sherman, who signed all three documents, all of our founding documents, including the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution. Roger Sherman. John Hancock, you know, with the famous signature. And Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury, and of course one of the great founding fathers, Thomas Paine, Common Sense. These are the times that try men's souls. Very strong abolitionist. None of them had slaves. None of them. But then there were some of the founding fathers that had slaves. But even they spoke out against slavery, including George Washington, who freed his slaves after he died. And you had Patrick Henry, who had slaves, but he spoke out against slaves and freed his slaves. Give me liberty or give me death. John Jay, James Madison. Ben Franklin had two slaves, okay, and he freed them. He too became an abolitionist. So our founding fathers are on record. The ones that didn't own slaves, never owned slaves, and were powerful abolitionists, and then those that did enslaved, had slaves, but ended slavery or freed their slavery, freed their slaves and spoke out very strongly against it. But it's important to understand that we can't use today's standards to judge what was going on then. They were born into slavery. Slavery existed. There was no movement at that time until we created it to end slavery. And so it's really unfair to judge them by today's standards. So, but even with that time, with standards as they were, they spoke out against slavery, and they put that vision of equality before God, created equal by God, laid the seeds that would then eventually in this country be the basis for the final effort to end slavery in this country. So that's our record on slavery. But my friends, I want you to know there's more. We always hear about Thomas Jefferson. Well, what about the Northwest Ordinance? This was Articles of Confederation era, before we had signed, but the Confederation Congress, as we acquired the Northwest Territory, they enacted the Northwest Ordinance. And that territory became 5 states, including my own state of Indiana and other states, Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, and I think Wisconsin. But anyway, 5 states. They outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territories. That was in 1787. This was pre-Constitution. So we ended slavery. And when they became states, like Ohio in 1802, they ended slavery. Slavery was illegal, was abolished in those territories. And when they became states, there was no slavery. Slavery had already been abolished in those states. We signed the Act of Congress prohibiting the importation of slaves in March 2nd, 1807, that went into law, became enacted on the earliest date that it could based on the Constitution, prohibiting any involvement of this country, of the individual states, in any way with the importation of slaves. Now, you could keep the slaves that you had, and you can move them about, and you could trade. Yes, we understand that. But it's important to understand that slavery, the importing of new slaves, was ended January 1st, 1808, which was the earliest day that it could be enacted because it was written into our Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, that protected the state's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years from federal prohibition. This was something that we had to give to the southern states. They insisted on that to protect, I guess, their interests in importing more slaves. But it ended at the earliest date that it could possibly be ended. Enacted in 1807 and signed into law by Thomas Jefferson, yes, who we always hear was a slaveholder. Yeah, we got that message, okay? But he promoted strongly, vigorously that law and signed it into law. So the founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, opposed slavery. So we led the way in ending slavery. And last but not least, my friends, we then fought a war, the bloodiest war in our nation's history. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all of the wars we have fought in our history combined. Every war, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War and the war in Vietnam, and then the wars in the Middle East. More deaths in that effort to end slavery, that Civil War, the war to end slavery, than all other deaths from all other wars combined. So last but not least, my friends, we paid to end slavery with American blood and American treasure. And it's important to know, yes, maybe that war began because of the southern states seceding, but when Abraham Lincoln signed that Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, at that time on, and the bloodiest part of that war was still to be fought after that. That war at that time became a war to end slavery. So we are the leaders in abolishing slavery. We're not last. We didn't come to this game late. No, we led the way. So why am I harping on this, my friends? Because as I said at the beginning, we hear endlessly about slavery, and I've just gone through a history of slavery throughout the world briefly, and our role in ending slavery. My friends, our record is the best in the world. We were trailblazers in ending slavery. And all these efforts to delegitimize this country, to break this country down, to break the back of this country on the issue of slavery. Understand that our record is stellar when it comes to ending slavery. We have the best record in the world in ending slavery. We led the way in ending slavery. And now this whole thing with Juneteenth, I'm not going to go into that fraud of a holiday. I mentioned before that if you wanted a holiday, it should have been other great American days, the Emancipation Proclamation, the day that we ended the Civil War, or the day that we signed or ratified the 13th Amendment. But no, they picked this local holiday that is meaningful to Texas, has absolutely no significance to the nation. And now they hold it up this June 19th, Juneteenth, and they call it a new National Day of Independence, again, to try to discredit our wonderful day of independence, our national holiday of the 4th of July. And now we have a black national anthem. And I will say that, there's a lot of black leftists and their congressmen, and they're going on and on about it, how they don't feel right about celebrating Independence Day. Well, they're leftists. There's nothing you can do with them. But really, they're frauds. They discredit themselves. Anyone who would say, after what I've just gone through, which anyone could discover on their own, of our great record in ending slavery, to go on and on about trying to discredit and delegitimize this country, and to not celebrate the 4th of July, they disgrace themselves. They cover themselves in shame. We have the best record in abolishing slavery. That's it, my friends. You've got it. Nothing more to be said about it. Stand proud behind this great country. This is the country of freedom and liberty. This is the empire of liberty. And yes, this was the trailblazer in creating equality before God. Our document did that. And yes, we led the way in abolishing slavery. We are the role model for the world. End of discussion. All right, my friends, let's move on quickly to some other issues. In that vein, let's talk about Cuba. The poor lefties. I mean, Cuba, what are the great heroes of the left? Well, it would be people like Lenin and Stalin and how about Mao? I would say Mao takes the record for mass murder and genocide. But you got some other strong contenders there. You got Pol Pot, who killed 25% of his fellow Cambodians, another great mass murdering communist, Marxist, leftist. And then who else do we have? There's others. You had Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. But then you get old Fidel, the Castro boys, and Che, another folklore hero for the American left. These are all mass murderers, my friends. But there was something about the Castros, especially Fidel. He's passed away, go to hell. May his memory be obliterated. But the left always had this sort of affection for mass murderers in general. They always made excuses for them. They always excused them. They never really separated themselves from them. They paid them lip service. They protected them. Basically, leftism, Marxism, communism, it's a mass murdering movement. It has to be, because it is intrinsically evil. And the only way for it to maintain power is through mass murder, through genocide, through torture and imprisonment, and ultimately mass murder, torture, and genocide, because it is intrinsically evil and it leads to misery and poverty, and there is unrest, and the people revolt, and then they have to suppress them, and they do it violently. That is how Marxism works. But so here we have, and this is coming to all the other Marxist countries, and I'm going to tell you, CCP, it's coming to you too. Don't think that the CCP is so strong. They're nervous. They know that they suppress their people. But anyway, it's happening now in Cuba, and we support the Cuban people's right to liberty and they're waving American flags. What are the Democrats and LeBron and Oprah and Colin and all the other little phony frauds, the victims, the billionaire victims, the oppressed victim billionaires, that these black billionaire victims like Oprah and LeBron and Colin and all the rest of them, always whining and complaining, but they have all their mansions, always, as I always mentioned, in the lily whitest of neighborhoods. And of course, the victims in chief, Barack Hussein Obama and the lovely Michelle. There they are in Martha's Vineyard. I think it's about Martha's Vineyard, about 99% white. I mean, it's about as white as you can get. But we know they're down for the struggle. But how do they feel now when they see the American flags being waved in Cuba? That they're more pro-American than the Democrat Party is today. Basically, I want you to know that Fidel and his government, the Castro government, the Castro administration, this communist administration, they are the Democrat Party. There's no difference between them. They promote the same policies. They are one and the same. So they're actually upset with the Cuban people who are seeking liberation. Just like they were against the Iranian people when they were protesting against the Iranian government, the Ayatollahs, and that jihadist genocidal police state that the Democrats seem to want to keep working these nuclear deals with, enriching them so that they can promote more terrorism. Yes, the Democrat Party was upset with the people for wanting liberty in Iran, and they're upset with the people of Venezuela when they protest against Chavez, the commie, and now Maduro. They don't like that because they identify with the Marxist, communist, genocidal, mass murdering governments, and that includes the Castro government in Cuba. We say, Viva la libertad in Cuba. And poor Bernie and AOC and the squad, but really the entire Democrat Party. We know how upset they are because they identify, they support these tyrannical, Marxist, genocidal governments. That's what they are. They're leftist, Marxist, communist. There is no light separating them no light between them and the Marxist tyrannical governments that the people are protesting against. All right, let me move on, my friends, to just quickly the failure of medicine. I'm just going to briefly touch on the fact that, this whole COVID pandemic disgrace of the last 18 months, the utterly destructive policies that were imposed on us by our governments at all levels, at the local, state, and federal level. And as I've often said, including these really pathetic Republican governors like our governor here in Indiana, Governor Yokel, or Holcomb, as I guess he's known, that's his name, and many other terrible Republican governors, just about as bad as Governor Cuomo and Whitmer and Newsom, these little petty tyrants. But I want to just mention that establishment medicine, they, for so many of them, went along for the ride. Where were they in terms of therapeutics for the treatment of COVID? Already present with a long track record. Medicines like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and vitamin D and zinc and vitamin C and Zithromax, medicines that have been out on the market for decades, with in many cases billions of uses, and very, very safe, and so inexpensive and readily available. Why were they not out there? I'm talking about the CDC and the various medical boards of the different states. Why were they not allowing this to be used when it became apparent that it was showing up as helping people, especially if it was early stage, not when they're on a ventilator. I mean, it's too late no matter what you do at that point. But before they needed the ventilator, why were they not pushing these cheap, safe, alternative therapeutics? Why pushing the vaccines? Why were they carrying water for the big pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Moderna and J&J? And then why were they not speaking out against the absurdity of the social distancing and the quarantines and the endless testing and the mask mandates and the shutdowns and the lockdowns and the closing of schools, when early on we knew who were the at-risk populations? They were the elderly and the people that were very sick. They were obese. They had heart disease or hypertension or diabetes, or they were immunocompromised. But if you were not in that category, your risk for the virus is so low. Why did they not speak out against it? Why did it take just a few of these brave doctors that went out on a limb, like Dr. Bhattacharya and Gupta and Scott Atlas and a few others that we know about? And well, I spoke out against it. I'm not as well known as they were, but I wrote articles about it early on. I'm talking about not last April, but April of 2020, of the concept of targeted protection, of selective protection of at-risk populations. So in so many ways, we see the failure of establishment medicine. And I'm going to tell you, doctors, professional medicine, establishment medicine has truly covered themselves in shame. Instead of preventing the collateral damage of the shutdowns and the masks and the closures of schools and the failure to allow doctors and pharmacies to prescribe off-label use of the various therapeutics that I mentioned earlier, the HCQ and the ivermectin. They opposed it because they were on board. And another reason so many doctors today are employed, this is another issue I'll get into later, how we've lost the independent voice of medicine. Really a shame, but we'll touch on that later. But just a general comment, establishment medicine has disgraced itself, really covered themselves in shame. All right, I'm going to move on just quickly. Do we have time for a MossCapade, or are we at the end?
We're on your time.
So is it okay to continue?
I think you should. I think MossCapades is great.
All right, Miss Producer there. I'm going to tell you that I took a wonderful trip. You know, I'm just going to talk about this one part of a trilogy of trips to one of my truly favorite cities in the world, which is to Kyoto, Japan, and Kyoto, Nara, kind of twin sister cities. Just beautiful cities, magnificent cities. And I went there as a medical student. I'll tell that story later. Then I returned there after my sojourn in Southeast Asia. We'll tell that later. But then I went with my beloved daughter, Arielle. Arielle, my first daughter. I wanted my great friend Tateshi, a thoracic surgeon in Kyoto, who took me in when I was a medical student. And
That's a good story too.
yeah, we will get to that story, but there's like three or four stories out of Kyoto. I'm not going to use them all up on this one. But when I brought my beloved first daughter, it was like magic. She was 12. She was good with the piano, becoming pretty good. And Tateshi had a piano, and he was so happy because Tateshi always said, and he had five daughters, and he called them his five kittens. And I would always say, "How are the five kittens doing?" when we write letters before email. And he would always write beautiful letters, and the five kittens were fine, he would tell me. And then he always said, Rick-san. You know, san is the polite term that you add, I guess, a suffix to any person. You call them their name and san. And for extra respect, you would say sama. So I would call him Tateshi Sama or Tateshi San, and he would say Rick San. Japan is such a polite culture. I am a big fan of Japan. But anyway, he kept saying, Rick San, you must have children. Rick San, please have children. And well, you know, he turns out he was right. I should. I waited a bit. But anyway, I came along. I had four kids. That's not bad. But the first was Arielle, and I took Arielle and we explored Kyoto. And I tell you, it's magic. Spring in Kyoto is just magic. It's you know, you can walk around in Japan, in Kyoto, big city, more than 1 million people, late at night, and I have no fear. And the Japanese are such a civilized people. They don't know what violent crime is. You know, it does not. Maybe petty theft, but I don't think anything. They're so polite. But we saw all the beautiful temples. We went to Kiyomizu-dera. That's a long word, but it's a magical place, and it was lit up at night. They have a great festival at this wonderful temple at night, and we're walking at night again through the streets of Kyoto, a big city, and I have no fear. It's just a wonderful place, and we saw Nara. Which was the ancient capital of Japan. You know, there's a lot more to be said about it, but I just want to mention that I took this wonderful trip to one of my favorite cities, to Kyoto, and the sister city of Nara, with my beloved daughter when she was 12 years old. So truly a great MossCapade. My friends, we're going to close it now. I'm going to, as usual, we didn't get to everything, but we'll do it next time. And I want to mention that we are part of the great, or the new alliance, where we are the party of the working class, where we are no longer protecting corporations. Any of these big mega international transnational corporations, regulate the hell out of them. We're done protecting them. Tax the hell out of them. They're all communists anyway. We saw that. They're all woke communists. Tax them, regulate them, and where you can, break them up. Yeah, Coca-Cola, Delta, big tech, obviously. All these woke corporations. We're not with you anymore. I want to raise your taxes. We want to bring back industries. We want to bring back jobs to America. We want to secure our border. We want to stop the millions of illegal aliens that are coming into this country, obviously illegal. They become wards of the state. You know, isn't that sort of the definition of exactly the kind of immigrant you don't want? I mean, you want to raise the batting average of the country. You want to bring in productive people. How does it benefit the country when you're bringing in millions of people that when they first get into the country, they've broken the law, entering the country illegally, and then to take advantage of our public systems? We have to educate them. They bring down the quality of our schools. But getting back to the reset, the realliance, the new alliance, they compete for jobs with our working poor. They lower wages. So we want to secure our borders. We want to deport all the illegal aliens, every one of them. I'm sorry. every one of them. We'll start with the violent criminals first. I know the left, they want to protect the drug peddlers and MS-13 and the violent felons and the rapists. They seem to like them. They're letting them out of jail. They want to give them benefits, but I don't. So we want, again, speak to the reset, and that means secure borders as well, my friends. All right, so I'm going to mention that we have a website. I urge you to check that out. You'll see my articles and other things. A lot of great pictures of my travels overseas. And that's richardmossmd.com, richardmossmd.com. And let me also mention, I have a couple of books that I think you will enjoy. The first one, Matilda's Triumph, about my beloved mother and her efforts to raise her 5 boys as a single mom before the age of the single mom, worked every day, never went on welfare, and she somehow kept it together. God bless my mother. She is always remembered. And my second book, A Surgeon's Odyssey, about my travels overseas as a volunteer surgeon, a head and neck cancer surgeon in South Asia, working in Thailand, Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. Really a good read. I recommend them both to you. You can look at them get them from Amazon. You can also order them through my website at richardmossmd.com. My friends, thank you. We'll see you next week, same time.